In early September 2022, a newly married couple in Houston, Texas, began their life together after a small wedding attended by close friends and family. The husband, Daniel Reed, was 28 years old and worked as a sales manager for a local car dealership. He was known by his colleagues as a calm, hardworking, and disciplined man. His friends often described him as someone who valued loyalty and responsibility. The wife, Melissa Carter, was 26 years old. She worked as a receptionist in a dental clinic not far from their home. Melissa was known as friendly, social, and easy to approach. Many of her friends admired her outgoing nature and how she could easily connect with people around her. The couple decided to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in a suburban area of Houston. It was a quiet neighborhood close to grocery stores, schools, and a community park. The two of them were often seen walking together in the evenings, giving the impression of a normal and happy start to married life. Daniel's father, Richard Reed, who was 55 years old, lived nearby. Richard had been divorced for almost 10 years. He often visited his son and new daughter-in-law, especially in the first few weeks after the wedding. His presence seemed supportive at first, and neighbors thought it was natural for him to spend time with the young couple as they settled into their new life. On the surface, nothing seemed unusual. To those around them, Daniel and Melissa appeared to be beginning their marriage with stability and hope. However, beneath that image, a series of choices and hidden actions would later lead to a shocking and tragic end just 1 month after the wedding. Daniel Reed grew up in Houston, Texas, in a middle-class family. He was the only child of Richard Reed and Susan Reed. His parents divorced when he was still a teenager, and he lived most of his youth with his mother. Despite the separation, Daniel remained close to his father, Richard, who often visited and supported him through school and early adulthood. Daniel studied business management at a local community college and later worked in sales. Over the years, he built a reputation as a reliable employee and someone who wanted to create a stable future for himself. By his late 20s, Daniel felt ready to settle down. He had been saving money and was interested in starting a family. When he met Melissa Carter through mutual friends in 2020, the two quickly formed a connection. Melissa was younger, lively, and very social, which complemented Daniel's more reserved and serious personality. They began dating steadily, and within 2 years, Daniel proposed to her. Friends and family considered them a compatible couple, despite some differences in personality. Melissa Carter, on the other hand, came from a different background. She grew up with 2 siblings in a household that often struggled financially. Melissa had ambitions of becoming a nurse but ended up working as a receptionist at a dental clinic. Many people who knew her described her as charming and approachable. She was someone who liked attention and enjoyed being around others, both in her workplace and social gatherings. Her friends often noticed that she liked to maintain a lively social life, even after she started dating Daniel. When the couple married in late August 2022, the wedding was relatively small but meaningful. It was held at a local church with around 50 guests, mostly family and close friends. Daniel's father, Richard, attended and gave a short speech, expressing how proud he was to see his son start a new chapter in life. Neighbors and relatives remembered the wedding as simple, heartfelt, and filled with optimism. After the wedding, Daniel and Melissa moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet suburban area of Houston. The apartment complex was modest but clean, with a small shared garden area where residents often greeted one another. Daniel adjusted quickly to married life, taking pride in providing stability. He often left early for work and returned home in the evenings, hoping to build a routine that would support their relationship. Melissa continued working at the clinic, where she maintained her friendly nature with both patients and co-workers. At this stage, nothing appeared out of place. Their daily lives were like many other young married couples, balancing work, adjusting to new roles as husband and wife, and planning for the future. They spoke to neighbors, occasionally joined community events, and visited Daniel's father, who lived only a few miles away. Richard Reed, Daniel's father, played a consistent role in the early days of the marriage. At 55 years old, he worked as a contractor and spent much of his time alone since his divorce. He welcomed the new marriage and frequently came to visit Daniel and Melissa, sometimes bringing food or helping with small repairs around the apartment. To outsiders, his involvement looked supportive and harmless. Daniel seemed comfortable with his father being part of their new routine, and Melissa appeared to accept his presence as well. In the first weeks, Daniel focused on strengthening his role as a husband. He often talked to friends about wanting to build a family soon. He shared small details about how he wanted to eventually buy a house in the area and create a stable home for Melissa and any children they might have. His close friends described him as hopeful and committed to the idea of making the marriage last. Melissa, meanwhile, seemed to continue living in a way that reflected her social character. She liked spending time with coworkers after work, attending casual gatherings and staying active online. To Daniel, this was not unusual since she had always been outgoing. He trusted her independence and believed that their differences in personality could balance the relationship. At this point, no clear signs of conflict were visible. Friends and relatives saw them as a couple in the early stage of marriage, dealing with small adjustments but generally happy. Their home became a common place for Richard to visit, sometimes sharing meals or conversations late into the evening. Neighbors often saw the three of them together and assumed it was a healthy family bond. In reality, beneath the surface of this seemingly normal beginning, certain dynamics were forming that would later have serious consequences. While Daniel focused on building stability, Melissa's behavior and interactions began to develop in ways that Daniel could not see. Richard's frequent visits, though outwardly ordinary, created a situation that quietly changed the atmosphere inside the young couple's marriage. The initial situation, as observed by others, showed nothing unusual. A newly married couple living in a modest apartment, a supportive father nearby, and two individuals trying to build a future together. Yet these same conditions, Daniel's trust, Melissa's social nature, and Richard's presence, would become the foundation for the conflict that soon followed. As the first month of Daniel and Melissa's marriage unfolded, life appeared steady from the outside. Daniel kept his regular work schedule at the car dealership, leaving early in the morning and often returning home after 7 p.m. Melissa maintained her job at the dental clinic, where she was usually done by late afternoon. Because of the difference in schedules, Melissa often had more free time in the evenings, which she sometimes spent with friends or at home. During this period, Richard Reed, Daniel's father, continued visiting the couple's apartment. At first, his presence seemed supportive. He occasionally stopped by with groceries, helped fix minor household issues, or simply joined them for dinner. Daniel appreciated this, thinking his father was trying to be part of their new family life. Melissa also welcomed him at first, showing polite hospitality whenever he came over. However, as days passed, Richard's visits became more frequent. Sometimes he appeared unannounced when Daniel was still at work. Melissa did not initially find it uncomfortable, since she saw him as her father-in-law and wanted to maintain a good relationship. Richard, divorced and living alone for years, found comfort in the company of the young couple, but particularly with Melissa, who was always warm and talkative. What started as casual conversations in the living room gradually became longer interactions when Daniel was absent. Melissa often offered him coffee or dinner, and Richard responded with stories from his past, advice about life, or jokes that kept the atmosphere light. Over time, a private familiarity began forming between them, unnoticed by Daniel. Around the second week of their marriage, Melissa's friends noticed a change in her behavior. She began declining invitations to group outings, explaining that she was busy at home or spending time with family. Yet, she did not mention that some of those evenings were spent alone with Richard. The closeness developed quietly without clear acknowledgement, but it started crossing boundaries that were not typical of a father-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship. Melissa, who enjoyed attention and connection, did not resist Richard's company. Richard, on the other hand, began showing signs of interest that went beyond a supportive parent role. He complimented her frequently, sometimes on her appearance or her energy. These remarks, while not openly inappropriate at first, grew more personal over time. Melissa did not push him away, which allowed the situation to continue. By the third week, Richard was visiting almost every other day. Daniel, unaware of the depth of his father's presence, assumed everything was normal. He trusted both Melissa and Richard, never imagining that his openness would create vulnerability. Daniel even encouraged his father to stop by if he was lonely, not realizing how this trust would eventually work against him. The first real turning point happened when one of Melissa's co-workers accidentally saw her in a coffee shop with Richard one afternoon. They appeared comfortable, sitting close and talking with familiarity. The co-worker later asked Melissa casually, "Was that your father? You two looked very close." Melissa quickly dismissed the question, saying it was just her father-in-law and that they often spent time together since Daniel worked late. At the moment, it seemed like a harmless explanation, but it showed how the relationship was becoming more visible to outsiders. As the days went on, Melissa began receiving text messages from Richard, not always about practical matters. Some were short greetings, others more personal comments. She responded regularly, and this quiet communication built a channel that excluded Daniel completely. Their bond grew under the surface, away from the attention of neighbors or friends. Daniel, focused on his career and building savings, remained unaware of these interactions. He continued speaking positively about his father's involvement, even mentioning to a friend that he was glad Melissa and Richard got along well. To him, this was a sign of family harmony. But underneath that belief, the boundary between family roles had already begun to blur. Melissa, although married, was engaging in a closeness with Richard that risked turning into betrayal. Richard, rather than maintaining distance, leaned further into his attraction and attention toward her. The problem at this stage had not yet fully revealed itself. No major conflict had occurred, and Daniel was still living under the impression that his marriage was strong and his father was supportive. But the foundation for a serious rupture was already in place. The combination of Melissa's need for attention, Richard's loneliness, and Daniel's trust created an environment where betrayal could take root without immediate detection. The beginning of the problem was not marked by one dramatic event but by a series of small, subtle choices. Frequent visits, private conversations, casual texting, and moments of comfort gradually shifted into a dangerous closeness. What seemed like harmless family bonding was, in reality, the start of a situation that would soon break trust and lead to irreversible consequences. At the end of their first month of marriage, the stage was quietly set. To the outside world, Daniel and Melissa were still the image of a young couple adjusting to life together. But inside their home, a hidden connection between Melissa and Richard had already crossed into forbidden territory. It was this hidden dynamic that would soon push the marriage into crisis and trigger the tragic events that followed. By the fourth week of Daniel and Melissa's marriage, subtle warning signs began to emerge, although Daniel himself remained largely unaware of them. To neighbors, friends, and even co-workers, everything still appeared ordinary. Daniel left for work each morning, Melissa kept her job at the clinic, and Richard continued his regular visits. From the outside, nothing suggested that conflict was building. But inside the relationship, small cracks had started to show. Melissa's interactions with Richard were no longer limited to casual visits or polite conversations. The texting between them had become more frequent and more personal. Richard often messaged Melissa in the afternoons, asking about her day or making light-hearted jokes. Melissa responded with enthusiasm, sometimes more quickly than she did to Daniel's messages. Their communication created an undercurrent of intimacy that went unnoticed by Daniel, who assumed Melissa was simply busy with her friends or work. The situation began to strain Melissa's behavior at home. She became less engaged in conversations with Daniel after he returned from work. While she still fulfilled daily routines, cooking, organizing, or talking briefly with him, her focus seemed divided. Daniel noticed she was often distracted with her phone, but when he asked, she said she was just chatting with her co-workers. Trusting her completely, Daniel did not press further. One evening, Daniel's close friend James visited the apartment for dinner. James, who had known Daniel since college, immediately noticed how often Richard dropped by. During the meal, Richard entered the apartment casually, greeted everyone, and sat down as though it were his own home. While Daniel didn't see this as unusual, James found it odd. Afterward, he privately asked Daniel if he thought his father was spending too much time with the couple. Daniel dismissed the concern, saying, "He's just trying to help out. I'm glad he and Melissa get along." James left the matter alone, but this interaction hinted at what others were starting to notice. Richard's presence was unusually strong in the couple's daily life. The tension escalated further when Melissa's co-worker, the same one who had seen her with Richard at the coffee shop, again noticed them together, this time in a grocery store. They were shopping side by side, laughing, and acting in a way that suggested more than just an Allah familiarity. When the co-worker later brought it up gently, Melissa brushed it off again, saying she and Richard often handled errands when Daniel was busy. But the explanation did not fully convince those around her. At home, Daniel remained unaware. His long work hours left him little opportunity to see the dynamics between Melissa and his father during the day. Still, certain changes caught his attention. Melissa had become more protective of her phone, often turning it face down or taking it into another room when messages came in. When Daniel casually asked about it, she replied, "It's just private conversations with my friends. Nothing important." Since Daniel valued trust, he avoided pressing her with questions. By the end of the month, the unspoken closeness between Richard and Melissa had crossed into secrecy. Richard began visiting late in the evenings when Daniel was working overtime or out with colleagues. Sometimes Melissa let him stay for hours. Their interactions had moved far beyond what Daniel could reasonably imagine, though no open confrontation had yet occurred. The real turning point in the rising tension came when Daniel returned home unexpectedly one evening. He had left work early after finishing a task ahead of schedule. Expecting to surprise Melissa, he arrived around 6 p.m., an hour earlier than usual. When he walked into the apartment, he found Richard sitting on the couch with Melissa. They were watching television, appearing unusually relaxed. Though nothing inappropriate was happening at that exact moment, the sight unsettled Daniel. He was surprised by how comfortable they looked together without him. Melissa quickly explained, "Your dad just stopped by to keep me company. We were watching a show while waiting for you." Richard added with a smile, "I didn't know you'd be home early." Daniel brushed it off outwardly, but something about the situation lingered in his mind. He began to wonder if James's earlier concern had been valid. Still, Daniel convinced himself not to overthink. He trusted both his wife and his father, believing that suspicion would only harm his marriage. Meanwhile, Melissa felt the pressure of maintaining two roles at once. On the surface, she was Daniel's supportive wife. Privately, she was entangled in a relationship with Richard that she could not openly admit. The emotional conflict grew stronger as Richard's attention became more demanding. He no longer treated her interactions as casual. He sought more time and more closeness. Richard, driven by loneliness and attraction, failed to consider the consequences. Instead of setting boundaries, he encouraged Melissa to continue. He often told her, "Daniel doesn't need to know everything. What we have is just between us." These words reinforced secrecy, pushing the situation further into betrayal. The tension also began to affect Melissa's work. Coworkers noticed she was distracted, often checking her phone or stepping outside to make private calls. While no one confronted her directly, rumors began circulating quietly that something unusual was happening in her personal life. For Daniel, the rising tension revealed itself in subtle frustrations. He felt Melissa becoming distant, yet every time he asked, she reassured him that everything was fine. His instincts told him something was off, but his trust prevented him from pressing harder. By the final week of September, the marriage was already under severe strain, though Daniel did not yet realize the full truth. Melissa's double life had created a fragile situation where exposure could happen at any moment. Richard's repeated involvement, combined with Melissa's secrecy, placed Daniel in the center of a betrayal that was hidden but growing closer to being revealed. The stage was now set for the climax. All it would take was one moment, one discovery for Daniel's trust to shatter completely. That discovery, when it came, would not only end his marriage but also trigger a series of irreversible events leading to tragedy. The breaking point arrived in early October, almost exactly 1 month after Daniel and Melissa's wedding. By this time, Daniel's unease had quietly grown, though he had tried to suppress his doubts. He noticed Melissa was more distant than before, Richard was visiting too often, and certain small details no longer made sense. Yet Daniel continued to hold on to trust, hoping he was simply imagining problems. The climax began on an ordinary weekday evening. Daniel was scheduled to work late, staying at the dealership to complete end-of-month reports. However, an unexpected power outage at work forced the office to close early. Daniel left 2 hours ahead of schedule and decided not to call Melissa, thinking he would surprise her with takeout for dinner. When Daniel arrived at the apartment complex around 6 p.m., he noticed Richard's truck parked outside. At first, he assumed his father had stopped by for a casual visit, something that had happened many times before. Carrying a bag of food, Daniel unlocked the door quietly and stepped inside. What he saw immediately changed everything. Richard and Melissa were in the living room, sitting closer than what could be explained as innocent. Their body language and expressions revealed intimacy that could no longer be denied. They did not notice Daniel at first, but when they turned and saw him standing there, the atmosphere froze. Daniel dropped the bag of food to the floor. Shock spread across his face as he tried to process the scene. His voice was unsteady when he finally spoke. "What is this? What's going on here?" Melissa stood up quickly, her expression shifting from surprise to panic. She stammered, "Daniel, it's not what you think. We were just talking." But Daniel interrupted sharply. "Don't lie to me. I can see what's happening." He turned to his father, his voice filled with disbelief. "Dad, how could you do this? With my wife?" Richard stayed seated at first, his face tense. After a pause, he responded, "Daniel, I didn't plan for this. Just happened. We didn't mean to hurt you." The words only fueled Daniel's anger. His trust, which had held him back for weeks, collapsed in an instant. The betrayal was not only from his wife but also from his own father, the two people he trusted most. Melissa tried to calm the situation, stepping closer to Daniel. "Please listen to me. We didn't want you to find out like this. I was confused. I made mistakes. But I still care about you." Daniel stepped back, his face hardening. "Care about me? You betrayed me in my own home. Both of you." The confrontation escalated quickly. Daniel demanded the truth, asking how long it had been going on. Melissa admitted in fragments that it had started weeks earlier, shortly after the wedding. Richard said little, mostly lowering his head, but his silence confirmed the reality. The apartment, once a place of new beginnings, now became the setting of betrayal and anger. Daniel's emotions shifted rapidly, shock, sadness, rage, all mixing in a way he could not control. He felt humiliated and destroyed, unable to reconcile what he had just witnessed. Melissa pleaded for calm. "Daniel, please, let's talk about this later. We can figure things out. Don't make this worse." But Daniel's trust was gone. He raised his voice, shouting, "There's nothing left to figure out. You both crossed a line that can never be undone." Richard finally stood up, attempting to steady the situation. "Daniel, I know this is painful, but let's handle this like adults. We can talk and try to move forward." Daniel's response was sharp. "Move forward? After what you've done? You're not only my father, you were supposed to protect me, not destroy me." The confrontation reached its peak when Daniel, overwhelmed with anger and despair, went to the kitchen and grabbed a knife from the counter. Melissa screamed, begging him to stop. Richard stepped forward, trying to calm his son, but the intensity in Daniel's eyes showed that reason was slipping away. The shouting turned into chaos. Melissa tried to pull Daniel back, but in the struggle, Daniel's emotions overcame him. The betrayal and rage clouded his judgment entirely. In the heated moment, he stabbed Melissa. She fell, and the apartment filled with panic and horror. Richard shouted Daniel's name, trying to intervene, but it was too late. Melissa lay on the floor, bleeding heavily, her pleas fading. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, realizing what he had done. His body shook, the knife still in his hand. The neighbors, alarmed by the screams, called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene. They found Melissa on the ground, Richard in shock, and Daniel holding the weapon, unable to process the reality of his actions. The tragic climax had come to pass. What began as trust and hope 1 month earlier ended in betrayal and irreversible violence. Daniel was taken into custody, Richard gave his statement, and Melissa was pronounced dead at the scene. The moment that changed everything was not only the discovery of the betrayal but Daniel's inability to control the storm of emotions it created. The climax ended the marriage, destroyed the family, and marked the beginning of a criminal case that would soon move into the courts. After the incident in early October, the case moved quickly into the legal system. The police arrived at the apartment within minutes of the neighbor's emergency call. Daniel Reed was arrested on the spot without resistance. He appeared stunned and in shock, his hands trembling as he was placed in handcuffs. Melissa Carter was pronounced dead at the scene, and Richard Reed, still shaken, provided the officers with his version of events. In the days that followed, news of the case spread through the local community. The story of a young marriage ending in such a violent way drew attention from local media. Reports highlighted the unusual circumstances. A husband accused of killing his wife after discovering her affair with his own father. For many, It was difficult to understand how a family bond could collapse into such tragedy within just 1 month of marriage. Daniel was charged with second-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that while the crime was not premeditated in the sense of long planning, Daniel had made a conscious choice in the moment when he took a knife and attacked Melissa. His defense attorney, however, built the case around emotional shock, betrayal, and temporary loss of control. The trial began several months later, in March 2023, at the Harris County Courthouse in Houston. The courtroom was filled with spectators, reporters, and family members. On one side sat the Carter family, grieving the loss of their daughter. On the other side was Daniel's mother, Susan, who had divorced Richard years earlier but came to support her son. During the trial, the prosecution presented evidence step by step. They showed photographs of the crime scene, text messages between Melissa and Richard, and testimonies from neighbors who had heard the argument and screams. One neighbor testified that Daniel had shouted, "You betrayed me," moments before the stabbing. Richard Reed was called as a key witness. His testimony was difficult and emotional. He admitted to forming an inappropriate relationship with Melissa, confirming that it had begun during the weeks after the wedding. When asked why he allowed it to happen, Richard responded quietly, "I was lonely and I made choices that I regret. I never imagined it would lead to my son's life being destroyed." His words, while confirming the betrayal, also revealed the heavy weight of guilt he carried. The defense attorney argued that Daniel had been under extreme emotional distress at the time of the crime. They presented evidence of Daniel's consistent work ethic, his lack of criminal history, and testimonies from friends who described him as calm and responsible before the incident. A psychologist testified that Daniel experienced what is often described as acute emotional breakdown, a sudden collapse of rational thinking under overwhelming betrayal. Melissa's co-workers also testified, providing context about her behavior in the weeks before her death. They explained that she had seemed distracted, often on her phone, and at times was seen with Richard outside of work. These testimonies strengthened the narrative of the affair but also highlighted how Melissa's actions had become visible to those around her. The jury listened to hours of testimony and reviewed evidence carefully. The prosecution emphasized that no matter the emotional circumstances, Daniel made the decision to use violence. The defense countered by asking the jury to consider the extraordinary betrayal he had experienced. His wife and his father, two people he trusted most, had engaged in a relationship behind his back. After 2 weeks of trial, the jury reached a verdict. Daniel Reed was found guilty of second-degree murder. However, because the court recognized the unique emotional context, his sentence was set at 22 years in prison rather than life. The judge stated, "While the betrayal you experienced is undeniable, the law cannot excuse the choice you made to take a life. Justice requires accountability, but it also acknowledges the extraordinary circumstances that led to this tragedy." Daniel showed little reaction as the sentence was read. His expression remained distant, as though still processing the chain of events. Susan Reed, his mother, wept quietly in the courtroom. Richard Reed, sitting in the gallery, lowered his head and did not speak. After the trial, Melissa's family released a brief statement to the media. They expressed sorrow for the loss of their daughter and acknowledged the complexity of the case. "There are no winners in this situation," her sister said. "We lost Melissa, Daniel lost his freedom, and an entire family has been broken." For Richard Reed, the trial did not bring criminal charges against him since his relationship with Melissa, while morally unacceptable, was not illegal under Texas law. However, his role in the case left him isolated from both families. He faced harsh criticism from the community and chose to move away shortly after the trial concluded. In the weeks following the verdict, Daniel began serving his sentence in a state correctional facility. His legal team announced they would not file an appeal, acknowledging that the jury had balanced both accountability and context in their decision. Daniel himself expressed regret during a brief statement before sentencing. He said, "I wish I had walked away that night. I can't take back what I did and I will carry it for the rest of my life." The resolution of the case closed the courtroom chapter, but it did not heal the deeper wounds left behind. A marriage of 1 month ended in death, a father's betrayal destroyed his relationship with his son, and 2 families were left fractured beyond repair. The legal process provided closure in terms of justice, but it could not restore the trust and lives that had been lost. The aftermath of this case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The tragic chain of events left a permanent mark on both families, who struggled to process what had happened. For the father, the weight of his actions was immense, as his hidden affair set the stage for the destruction of his own family. For the groom's relatives, the loss of their son to a life sentence in prison was devastating. They had once celebrated his marriage with joy, but now they were left only with grief and unanswered questions. In the courtroom, the case drew attention from the wider community, who were left shocked by how quickly a marriage full of promise turned into tragedy. Many questioned how secrecy and betrayal could lead to such irreversible consequences. Legal experts pointed to the case as a reminder of how deeply personal choices can intersect with the law, leading to outcomes no one initially expects. From a broader perspective, the story became a reflection on trust, honesty, and the fragile nature of relationships. The events showed how hidden affairs and poor communication can escalate into dangerous conflicts. While many viewed the groom as fully responsible for the violence, others recognized that the layers of betrayal and secrecy had created an environment where destructive emotions built up unchecked. For the community, the incident was a somber lesson in the importance of transparency within relationships and the responsibility individuals carry for their actions. The trial may have closed with a sentence, but the emotional consequences continued for years, serving as a lasting warning of how quickly trust can collapse and how devastating the results can be when it does. This conclusion reminds us that behind every court case are real lives, permanently altered by the choices made in moments of secrecy, anger, or weakness. In the end, this tragedy illustrates how fragile human bonds are and how a lack of honesty can lead to outcomes that affect everyone involved.